Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for OUA football. Me and Tom are back on the mics after a weekend of offensive filled football across the board. Tom, of course I want to know how you're doing, but we talked about this, kind of into the preseason after the first week, that cliche, but it seems like it's been bearing out as we are barreling into the midway point of the year. Offenses take a little bit of time. So many of these games, that seems to be the case, even if only on one side of the ball in some of these teams. How the heck are you doing? What'd you think about some of these more explosive scores than what we've seen so far in the first couple weeks?
Well, I'm doing great. It's awesome to see some offenses really start to come off here that aren't dressed in that Western purple. So yeah, it was great to see it. The caliber that those offenses were going off against maybe comes into play a little bit here, but still exciting plays, exciting scores, high scores, and another great week of football.
Most definitely. We talked about it in the preview pod, I guess, how excited we were to get Queens back in the fold after that, I want to say, disappointing loss, because it was a hell of a win by Laurier. Nice to get them back in the fold. Can't wait to talk about that game and just some of the outstanding performances that we got across the board. So let's actually go right there, because that's normally where we go at this moment with our players of the week. We'll start on the offensive side of the ball. Tom, to some, this is an obvious pick. And frankly, it is an obvious pick. I'll give you the honor, though.
I appreciate it, my man. It's got to go to our guy, Taylor Elgersma. This dude goes off. He listens to the podcast. He hears us. Oh, Taylor hasn't thrown a passing touchdown yet. What's going on with Laurier? Dude goes 30 for 35, 440 yards, and 6 touchdowns to shut up the At the 55 podcasters. So yeah, it was a hell of a thing. It was a hell of a performance by him. He also runs one in, so he finishes with 7 total touchdowns. The quality that he was going up against is something that we're going to get into 100%.
Yeah, baby.
But you can't overlook those stats. Those are unreal stats.
No, you can't. And as we kind of talked about it before we started recording, in talking about that, it kind of came out where it's like, well, but the first week we had to shout out Evan Hillock, even if he was going up against York. You still got to go out and do it to put up those numbers. And we'll see going into the Battle of Waterloo, and we'll obviously save that conversation for the Week 4 preview podcast if that continues, because in the early returns of this season, Waterloo is the much stronger team than Guelph. Not stronger, much stronger. But frankly, that's actually where I'm going to go on this one. And I don't know if Taylor listens, though I know he's a supporter of us. He has some of our swag, even if it came as a result of losing a bet with me due to the team I was coaching in London last year beating his alma mater. I'm certain his dad listens. Shout out to Mark Elgersma. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned the competition. I'm not taking anything away with him. Like we said, the Evan Hillock parallel is there. But I was, of course, in the house to watch Windsor and Waterloo. And there's a lot of things I'm excited to talk about with that game. But we discussed how, obviously, Windsor, not that we didn't think they could run the ball. We knew that. And then having that groundbreaking rushing game they did against Guelph. If this team is going to go where they want to, not that Danny Skelton's had anything but a really good year so far, let's see if they can unleash him a little bit and see what he can do. And that's where I want to give my shout out for Offensive Player of the Week, because Mr. Skelton goes 23 of 33, 391 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. The interception, a shot he took at the end of the second half, time winding down, trying to get it into the end zone. And, some of the comments I have as far as sort of areas where he can start to improve, and there are certainly a lot of things that Windsor team is no doubt, despite picking up the win, not going to be pleased about. And Skelton being no other. But once again, that was, if only because it connected to our commentary of like, let's see you unleash what you can truly be. And if you put together that type of an effort with what that running game can be, wow. I think we're going to save a conversation about our own personal power rankings for perhaps the next episode. And It might get spicy. It might get spicy. It might be chalk, but man, Windsor is a sweet team. They are for real. Defensive side of the ball, Tom, where are we going?
Well, on the defensive side of things, I think the guy you have to go to is somebody from Windsor Waterloo. However, I want to give a special shout out because you got a chance to call that game. You got a chance to see everything in person. I want to directly hear it from you. But I want to give a special shout out to Ifena Onyeka. That dude, even though he wasn't coming off the stat line, playing defensive end for Carleton against these Western Mustangs, my God, that guy was balling out. You know, he came the closest to anybody of sacking Evan, but Evan's phenomenal in the pocket, and I'll get into that later. But man, he was bullying offensive linemen at times. And like you said before we started the podcast, watching him and Eric Anderson go at it was probably the best part of that entire game. Just two clear all-stars going up against one another was just outstanding. So yeah, I want to give a special shout out to Mr. Onyeka.
Yeah, that was a ton of fun. If only for former linemen like ourselves. But and man, what a game did Eric Anderson have? Holy smokes, I'm not just gassing him up because I love him. I know him personally, but he's just so good at the football. I am going to Waterloo Windsor, and I'm directing my commentary towards a player for Waterloo, and I'll save some shout outs I want to give to some of the Windsor defensive players when we get there, because it was actually, for me personally, that was like a really special point of emphasis of wanting to actually get a better sense of who are some of these guys. We'd started to get a couple of those names as we saw some of the numbers kind of come in, especially off that Guelph game. But the person you were alluding to in specific is number 9 for the Waterloo Warriors, Tyson Hergott. I believe we talked about him in one of the other games, maybe going back to the Ottawa game, I believe, and maybe the performance against York. And he was all over the ball, doing like quite literally darn near everything you could do to contribute as a defensive lineman. He's obviously racking up his tackles, 6.5, both solos and assisted. He's getting in the backfield, picking up a sack. He's forcing fumbles. He has a breakup, batting down a ball that Skelton was looking to hit his man on, and just so disruptive in so many ways. And it reminded me, and it's reminding me as we're kind of going and talking about him, and you'll have to help me out. Maybe the parallel's way off, but of a defensive end that you played with, one of the DNs you played with, who had the interception pick 6 in our Yates Cup,
Mr. Michael Kashik.
God.
Yeah,
I shouldn't have even brought. But just like, is he a run stopper? Is he a pass rusher? Is he a supreme athlete? Is he the pulling guard's coming to kick me out, fullback, H-back's coming to kick me out, and I'm just going to put my shoulder, wrong arm you, and make you have to log it to the outside? It's actually kind of everything. And maybe I'm wrong on, I haven't looked at the tape of Mike Koshik in a number of years. It was literally just all of a sudden like an acid flashback of that interception in 2014. God damn it. Anyways, how about some special teams players? Shout out to Tyson Hergott.
Oh God. Well, I am, since we brought up McMaster, I am going back to McMaster for the special teams shout out. And once again, very similar to week 1, Western against York, McMaster against York. It's, it is what it is, but you look at the stats. Michael Horvat for these McMaster Marauders, he goes 4 for 4 in field goals, 8 for 8 in extra points for a total of 21 points. And in the 3 punts that he did actually have, obviously going on later into this game when a lot of the backups were in, of those 3, at least one of them made it inside the York 20-yard line, which once again, like we've talked about, is a very difficult thing to do. So my shout out has to go to Michael Horvat.
Ball still has to go through those uprights, even if you're scoring it a million times. And they darn near scored it a million times. So yeah, shout out to the special teams units out in Hamilton. For me, I'm going to split the baby on this one. I'm going to go to Varsity Stadium. And, as the saying goes, it takes 2 to make a thing go right. And it was Nico Cuomo blocking the punt and Keegan Vanek scooping and scoring it for the touchdown to put the Queens Golden Gales up 19-9 in the third quarter. A game that was a little tight early on, and Queens, and maybe, I don't know, I guess we saw in some of these games the better team just jumping on their opponent nice and early, but we've already talked about that Western model of maybe they're in a game tight, but just the way they beat you down, especially in the trenches, eventually they're going to get to you. Kind of felt that way going through that Queens-Toronto game, and we'll get to all the details of pick six early on for U of T and things like that kept the score close. But that was kind of opened up the floodgates for that kind of maybe Queens to like let that sigh and be like, okay, can we just beat the crap out of these guys? We are better. We're coming off a bye. Let's just do the thing. Anyways, shout out to Quemo and to Vanek on that. Those are our players of the week. Offensive, defensive, and special teams players. Well, speaking of kicking the crap out of, and speaking of the McMaster Marauders, let's go there to the Hammer, where your McMaster Marauders beat the York Lions, the York Fighting Lions, to the tune of 71-0. The first comment I'll say, and if you weren't aware, then I guess you didn't tune into our last podcast and you didn't tune into the Waterloo-Windsor game. I was doing the color commentating on that game along with the inimitable Adam McGuire, and I'll certainly say this again when we get to that game, but thank you again to Adam and the whole game day staff there for letting me on that. It was truly like a bucket list thing I've wanted to do for so long and had the most fun. Tom, you were, I'm trying to, in one of the Spider-Man movies, one of the newer ones, he's got his man in the chair. He's out there web swinging and doing his thing, fighting crime, and he's got his boy kind of like on the internet sending him whatever details. You were my guy in the chair during that game, giving me out of town scoreboards, because Lord knows you're not going to trust the OUA website for updates. And the one time we did, we got in trouble when they mixed up, ironically, a Mac York rugby game in which the score was 92-0, and poor Adam McGuire goes on the broadcast live and says, "Well, we have an update out of Hamilton. The Marauders are up 92-7. You blow up my phone. It's like 62-0 right now. What's going on?" We make the correction, everything like that. So, not 92-7, arguably 71-0 in some people's books might be worse. Tom, as we kind of set up, we're starting to think about our own personal, power rankings and things like that. Mac, sitting at 1 and 2, and I don't know if I don't have the standings in front of me to have the full, because we got a couple teams at 1 and 2. Mac is a really, really nice 1 and 2 right now. We got Mac, we got Waterloo, we got Guelph. No, Mac is far and above the best of those three teams. Mm-hmm. And then it's Waterloo, and then there's a certain couple layers of dirt, and then Guelph at 1 and 2 there. This is not going to be, if you thought this was going to have a happy ending when I talk about Guelph today, you were sorely mistaken. But thankfully, we're not there yet. Your Marauders put a beat down on the York Lions. I've said enough, but also seemingly said nothing so far. Why don't you try out the words?
I'll give a crack at the words, as you say here. Yes, it was really nice to see McMaster flex their muscles a little bit and show that, hey, you know what? When we have an offense and when we're clicking, we can put up points with the best of them. And I know, yes, it's against York and whatever, but it is still nice to see it as an alumni. That's awesome. One thing I will say, York finishes with 112 total yards on offense, 71 in the air, and 54 rushing. And you go, oh, wow, whatever. You look over the McMaster side, 570 yards of offense. Wow, that's so amazing. Rushing, 50 yards. The York Lions outrushed the McMaster Marauders. Guys, what the hell is going on here? I know that, this was really a passing showcase. They get Keegan Hall off and running. He goes 21 for 24. Luke Dahlman comes in. He goes 6 for 6. Steven Naricic comes in 9 for 12. So obviously they're trying to get their quarterbacks in the groove, get them ready to go, get that confidence building. but boys, 50 yards, 5-0. Come on. We got to do better than that.
We mentioned last week or going into this weekend, we didn't see Daniel Bossett, and we're still not seeing him. Braden Kelly getting the bulk of the carries, 8 attempts, 48 yards, 3 touchdowns, which also led to, one of the things I love because it was Bubba O'Neill, correct? On the broadcast, does a lot of work with CHCH and Hamilton, really great broadcast. And they put the camera on Kelly after the touchdown. He gives you the 1, 2, 3. I love the little swag there. I love when we get some personality out of our guys. I need to take a quick second to shout out their second leading rusher, and not because of the numbers, but just because of the love I have in my heart for one, Noah Amaral, the pride of London South Collegiate Institute, a guy I got to coach last year and get to know dearly. It was such a point of pride, and to see him get his first carries, and man, it was so special. This game in some ways was reminiscent of Western hosting Waterloo last year when they had 3 ball carriers go over 100 yards. I don't know. And funny enough, I sent you a link to a really neat little MAC history page that, once again, I have a lot of admiration for the way the Marauders do their game day stuff, kind of the, in-game entertainment and everything like that. Obviously, the program itself is storied and things like that. But on there, like the Marauders.ca webpage, you can actually find this like history of McMaster, and it like breaks it down by decades. Love that. So maybe we can go read through that again. But in all of the OU way, I'm racking my brain for the last time, if ever, a game saw 3 quarterbacks get over 100 yards passing. And what blows my mind, because I'm going through this game on the replay, and I don't think we're out of the second quarter. I don't think the first half had come to a close. And you're seeing, I think it was Naranchich who came in first, and then Thalman. But Hall's out, and at first I'm thinking like, oh my God, did I miss him take a bad hit? Is he hurt here? Because it's this, and then I go to the stat page. And I'm like, he already has 300 yards. He's got 2 touchdowns. He's 21 for 24. You already read that out. Yeah, okay, pull him from the game. And you know what? I guess, you talked about the running B there. Like this is kind of perhaps parallels our conversation with Windsor when, okay, they can run the ball with the best of them. Now let's see if you can, Danny Skelton can be the focal point. For you looking at this MAC club and, obviously coming off of 2 years of missed playoffs and things like that, you know what, them just looking like a competitor again, if they get in the playoffs, which I think the way they're projecting right now, they should, and maybe they win a first round game or they give a good fight or something of that nature. Maybe that's enough for this year off of 2 years of disappointment. But if they just are the sort of most dominant passing team in the OUA, if that's just where they say this is our bread and butter, and, going back to that offensive line, clearly they've cleaned some things up. It looks like they're using a bit more of the play action, letting those guys get into the defensive front, and that kind of jump set as us as offensive linemen know. And if you're listening and you know the position, it's a great tool to have to be able to slow down a pass rush. And as we talked about moving Keegan Hall to the pocket, how do you feel as an alum and just as a football analyst of them just saying, this is clearly where we have our advantage over perhaps everyone in the league. Let's hey, like playing with Beyblades back on the schoolyard, let it rip.
Yeah, 100%. I'm discovering very quickly that well, I always knew this, but I have a very high expectation of McMaster, regardless of what the score is, caliber of players on the field, just because I played there, and you and I talked about when you're alumni who have also played and you've won and things, you want the program to continue to build off of that. Anyways, long story. But I am very excited at how proficient the passing attack looks. I know I gave some crap about the run game, but my goodness, Keegan Hall, when he's on, he is on, man. We see him making these great decisions, escaping the pocket at times, like showing his athleticism, showing the cannon of an arm that he has, quite frankly, as well. And Jackson Cooling really showed out for them as well. He finishes 9 catches, 135 yards, and a touchdown. They've got some weapons in the air. I think, like you said, they found a bit of a rhythm with how they can properly block for Keegan and making sure that those O linemen can get into those defensive linemen and they can sort things out, even just keep them honest a bit and thinking that it's a run, and then giving some extra time so that Keegan can do his thing, even if that O line still needs a little bit of work. I think they looked really, really impressive here, and I am happy that they showed out offensively like this. But we talked about it with some other teams as well. If you don't have a solid run game, man, is it hard to get out of the OUA.
No, you're definitely right. And despite them staying undefeated, and we'll talk about them later on, there's some reason to believe that maybe Western, their spell over the OUA is starting to thin out perhaps a little bit, but those are famous last words, even though I'm certainly a proponent of that team, if only just because of, well, I like to see dominance, and I know so many people in that program and on that team. But while you were talking there, I had to go back to 2019. I just looked for like a random game. I pulled up their win against Ottawa where they had 35 points. Because here's the thing that comes to mind when I think about this. And of course, it was still Coach Ptacek there, and he's a former receiver himself, and he's calling up the offense now. And perhaps it's no surprise that as a former receiver, he wants to have this kind of air attack offense. And that, of course, was the era of Andreas Dueck, who was one of the best passing quarterbacks, one of the best quarterbacks of that era, an era of such incredible talent at the quarterback position. We know this. But one of the things I loved about that offense, and of course, we love this defense right now. We really like this defense. And those were some good defenses back then, too. Shout out to Josh Cumber, bridging those two eras. But what I loved about those offenses is that they had Dueck, but he didn't have, his just guy. And we did kind of worry, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, that with Hall and with Cooling having that Burlington connection, maybe that would become his safety blanket of just being like, where's number 2? And then everyone else. So going back to, like I said, this 2019 game, because this is what I loved about him, is that Dueck would spread the ball out. We had Michael Bazo with 9 receptions, Tommy Neild with 5, Blake Reason with 3, Tyson Middlemost with 2, Xander Tuchinski with 3, Justice Allen with 1, right? Spreading the ball out, so as a defense, you can't really lock in. You mentioned what Cooling did, the 9 receptions, but then you have Noah Puskis, and what an emotional moment that was for him, showing him on the sideline, his first OUA touchdown. And the Puskis family is, I'm assuming he's part of that family tree. Do you know about that family?
Yeah. Chris Puskis is the head athletic therapist for the McMaster Marauders. He's been there for a number of years now. After spending a bunch of time in the CFL, regardless of what everyone's experience is when you're going through McMaster, the people who have had Chris Puskis and have worked with him directly, they love this man. He cares about each individual person as much as humanly possible. He wants the best for the team and for the person themselves. He's just a phenomenal human being through and through. And to see his son get a chance to do something like this, it just brings such a huge smile to my face. And that knowing that is like McMaster royalty at this point, and getting him to get a chance to see that. When I watched Noah score that touchdown, man, I had ear to ear grin. That was amazing to see. It really was.
As you do just talking about it right now. So shout out to the Puskis family. But I won't go through all the names, but those are just 2 of the 13 receivers who caught balls. And of course, in a game where you score 71 points and you get deep into your bench, that's going to happen. But though Cooling is kind of the guy of that group, and you could look at a guy like Xander Tuchinski as perhaps the guy of, that 2019, if you were going to say who is the best receiver of this group. You could still name that, but it's so that's kind of my thinking on this. Really good defense, good special teams units. That was the days of help me out with the kicker they had back in those days.
Prio Cannon,
of course. What an era of great kicker names. You had Prio Cannon, you had Nathan Meshry, of course, Mark Leggio. Mm-hmm. You gotta love it. Anyways, that's just my thought on this. I want to throw back to you. Yes, with the westernification of the OUA, You got to be able to run it. But this is a team that beat that very Western Mustang team in London on this similar recipe. What do you have to say to that?
No, you're absolutely right. Having this, not only having a guy like a Jackson Cooling, but the ability and the trust to get it out to so many different receivers as well is also a massive part of this. And Keegan, from day one, has never really shown that, oh, I'm only going to go to the guys that I know how to throw to, whatever. You know, the other person that on that side with in the Nelson Lords connection there was James Priestner, and I believe he's been injured because we haven't seen him for the past couple of games.
Great call.
And so he's been finding these new guys as he's been going here, trusting in the fact that they've been throwing together. They're building that chemistry. Like, there's no worries about him favoriting, you know, one receiver or the next. He's just, Keegan wants to win. Keegan wants to find the guy who's open, who's going to make the play. And that's what he's been doing.
I have a shit-eating grin on my face if you're not watching, because my next comment is, well, Tom, if you are really wanting to see Mac get their run game going, tune in next week when they host Guelph. York will be hosting Carleton. Let's move on to our next game, where we are moving. Oh, we're here already. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. We're going up Highway 6.
We're going up Highway 6. Guelph, you were in timeout last week. Tom, what comes after timeout? You are like far closer in your just state of life to perhaps having a kid, if that's something that you and your wife are looking at doing at some point. I guess as a teacher, maybe I should have some sense of that, but I normally work with the older students. What goes after timeout if your kid's being an absolute just menace, and then they keep on menacing, and you say, what do I do? Do I just drop you off at grandma's house? Maybe that's what is Guelph. I'm dropping you off at Bubby's house, and you're going to stay there till you learn your lesson. You're going to eat borscht, and you're going to just, watch the Golden Girls with her all day long. Final score in this one, on their orientation day, with the house packed with alumni filling the stands, the pavilion, the end zone, Guelph 21, Laurier 60. Yeah. What makes me the most frustrated with this, Tom, is, and what was great, I was we're getting these updates. I'm on the broadcast. I'm supposed to have some level of professionalism and decorum or whatever. Is that this went the exact worst way that it could have, because we knew that Laurier had a really good defense. And Guelph's had some troubles on the offensive side of the ball. Early in the game, I actually liked how Guelph was moving the ball. They couldn't keep up with Laurier because Laurier was running PVA, which if you've never coached football, if you haven't played football, that stands for pass versus air. And we just said, you know what? Don't repeat the same stuff where you are the team that we look back on and say that like Team X really came alive when they got to play you, the same way Windsor did it last year and seemingly last week again. And Laurier with a sleeping giant and Taylor Elgersma that we've yet to see bust open a score and an effort like this. You read the numbers. I'll read them again. 30 for 35, 440 yards, 6 touchdowns. And a rushing touchdown as well. Guelph gave up 448 rushing yards last week, and they followed that up with giving 440 passing yards this week. They thought, hey, let's really hunker down and slow down the rush, and they held Laurier to just, 162 rushing yards. And then they forgot to play any semblance of defense in the secondary.
Yeah, I can tell that was therapeutic. You had something building in there. You had to get that out.
That felt great. I hope my dad's probably in the other room being like, "Oh my God, is he okay?" Tom, what do you have to say?
What I will say is that I can't remember a team that consecutively year after year has dealt with more injuries than Guelph has. In this game, hey, I'm not excusing this.
I'm making a face for our audio listeners. I'm making a face.
No excuses whatsoever. This was a bad game by Guelph, 100%. but you don't have Anthony Mortuzzo. There's no Brandon Farrigo. You don't have Christian Stewart. You don't have Cole Watson, apparently was supposed to come back for this game, re-injured himself in practice. He's now done for the year. You don't have Scott Murray. Like, all of those key guys on defense that you should have had, that's definitely going to make a difference. However, none of those guys play in the secondary. And my goodness, did that Guelph secondary have its struggles. There was, like we said, Taylor Elgersma throws for 6 touchdown passes. I wouldn't be absolutely 2. I think it's 3 if I remember correctly, but 2 or 3 touchdowns that Taylor throws where the receiver catches it and there is not a single Guelph defender within 15 yards of that person. Like, it was just, they seemed so off base. It just did not, this had zero semblance of what a Guelph Griffin team should be producing on the field.
And you shouted out Dennis McPhee, the defensive coordinator, and I'm not gonna, I don't know all that much about defense to begin with. Some would say I barely know anything about football on any level. And you know what? There's, the jury's still out on that one, and I'm not going to want to come across as critiquing someone who's forgotten more about football than I've ever come close to remembering. But the moment there was, I swear, after this one touchdown, they even panned over to Sheehan at one point. I don't know who it was, maybe in the headset talking to, but he was like almost laughing because at a certain point, what else can you do but laugh? Where Laurier winds up in a quad set of 4x1, Guelph seemingly is in a single high safety look, and there's the 3-hole receiver just runs a seam into the end zone. And this is where I not so jokingly say it looked like pass versus air, like you're just doing your easy ups before the game, like you're running Skelly, and Elgersma just flicks it into the corner of the end zone for whichever one that was. It was probably one of Ethan Jordan's touchdowns.
Yeah.
Yeah,
listen, what I will say is that when you have a loss like this, everybody's got to take the blame 100%. Like, you weren't producing really at any aspect. I think, shockingly, in previous years, certainly, the offense has really been the struggling point here. It's probably the one spot that was the bright spot, even though they had a ton of their own struggles compared to everything else. But Dennis McPhee knows his stuff. He knows defense. He knows Absolutely. What he's doing 100%. I think that with all of those injuries that I just said, how many first-year players are out there on that team for these Guelph Griffins, first or second-year guys? I think I counted at one point, and there was I think of a defense that had 12 players. I quite honestly, I think there was 7 or 8 guys that were in first or second year. And once again, we talk about it all the time. How important is game experience? When you're first and second year, even if you've been starting every single game, you've only got so many games that you could potentially do, and they haven't made it to the playoffs. So you just don't have that same kind of synergy here. There's no way, shape, or form in my mind that the game plan that they came up with was the thing that was wrong and that they're going off on or whatever else. Because when I was in that Guelph coaching room, the offense pretty much came from Coach Sheehan already, so he's obviously completely in the loop on that. But the defensive side of things, they sit down. Coach McPhee and Coach Sheehan sit down. They talk about things. They talk about what the game plan is. So Sheehan knows everything that's going on defensively, and the two of them are great football minds. Regardless of the product that they've put out in the field in the past couple of years, they are great football minds. They understand the game. But so for sure, Laurier came up with obviously a much better game plan, and it obviously worked really well. But there's so many times where you just look at it, you're like, that it has to be. One of the kids goes, there was an assignment that was missed or something along, because exactly like you said, there's no defensive assignment where a receiver comes completely free on a seam route with nothing else happening on a 4x1 set. It just doesn't happen.
You are 1000% correct. And it is the truth. Those injuries, once again, the institutional knowledge, the young players, it is just true. It's just
It's a perfect storm of crap. That's
and
what it is.
On top of it being, like I said, the orientation day game, and it's just like coming off of last week, and it's embarrassing. And how, like, I almost want to text him. How many times do you think Todd Galloway was just looking over the sidelines? Because if you don't know, after the Stu Lang era, Todd Galloway was the interim head coach. Then they went to Kevin McNeil, who was so Todd was the OC for Stu Lang when we won the Yates and went to those battles against you for that kind of early part of the 2010s. Then they went to Kevin McNeil, who was the DC during that time as the head coach. And then they went to Coach Sheehan. And of course, Galloway has since gone over to become the offensive coordinator. I think he does receivers and some other stuff with Laurier. McNeil does defensive line, special teams, I think some recruiting stuff at Western. How many times do you think Todd's looking across that sideline being like, oh, that's the guy you went with? I was the interim coach, and then you had to do this whole thing, and you wound up with okay, cool. All right. I'm at my alma mater. I want a Vanier here. You ask any of us around here, we're looking to win another one. Guelph, do your thing. Last thing I'll say, and, bad job by me, because this sounds like the type of thing. And part of me, when I heard people talk about this when I was at Waterloo, it kind of rung a bell, though not entirely. Did you know Marshall McRae was the Ford brothers' cousin?
I had heard that, yes.
Yeah. Well, they failed to secure the Ford brothers, even though it was Guelph or Waterloo in the day. At least they got his cousin, and he looks all right in there. And Aboud, looks all right in certain instances. But like I said, that's just like almost the most frustrating thing. Where I would have been okay with, Guelph, in some regards, 21 points against Laurier, though, of course, I'm sure there were some backups coming in at times. 21 points against this Laurier team. I'm like, well, in theory, hey, you gave them a better offensive showing than Queens did. Barring, of course, the blowout-y nature of this game. Yep. But it's just like, man, not to say that we didn't expect Laurier's offense to come alive, but it had to be against Guelph, right? It had to be. And yes, you're right. It was a perfect shitstorm of things. Do you want to say anything else about this game?
Yeah, well, what I will say is that when it was like the first quarter, end of the first quarter, whatever, I thought this was going to be a shootout because I think the first, if I remember correctly, so the first series, Laurier goes down and they score a touchdown. Elgersma hits Raiden Thorne. Absolutely outstanding. Guelph goes down, they get a field goal. Laurier comes back and they get another touchdown. You go, okay. And then Guelph puts a 10-play drive together, goes 91 yards for a major, and where it's 14-10, you go, oh my goodness, is this going to be something? Have they found something? Has Guelph found an offense? Have they found an answer? No, they have not. But it was exciting. Like there's flashes there. There's flashes of really incredible work that we've seen with these Griffins. But just, man, they cannot put anything together here. What I will say, and I do want to focus a little bit more on the Laurier side of things as well, because we've been talking about crap from the Griffin side. What I loved to see, Quinton Scott showcased that I've got the ability to run downhill, baby. He put his head down and he really ran people over, and he really, really impressed me with how he was running. He finished nine total rushes, 104 yards with a long of 35. But he showcased that, even if everybody else is injured, I can still carry the load. Tanner Nelms obviously came back as well. I think he was probably a little bit, they weren't using him as much. Maybe he was, he's back and he's healthy, whatever. But this was very clearly the Taylor Elgersma show. But you go back to what we were talking about before as well, and the amount of receivers that are catching balls here. Obviously, Raiden Thorne and Ethan Jordan are by far. Raiden Thorne finishes with the most yards, 5 catches, 134 yards and 2 touchdowns. But Ethan Jordan, 11 catches for 130 yards and another 2 touchdowns. Jace Atkinson, 4 catches, 71 yards and a touchdown. Quinton Scott, 4 catches, 50 yards. There's a big list of guys that Elgersma was able to find. And man, I was texting with a couple of Guelph insiders that I talk about, and this is where I get all my information from. And even them, all of them saying, man, Elgersma is the real deal. This kid looks special.
And of course, we knew it, and it was bound to happen. And hey, we'll see if it carries over for him next week and through the season, where Laurier will be hosting the Battle of Waterloo next week against the crosstown rival. And as we said, Guelph will be heading to Mac for the Battle of Highway 6. We'll talk about those in a few days. But speaking of Waterloo, let's head there next. For the game that, as I mentioned, once again, if you weren't aware, if you didn't listen to our Week 3 preview pod, if you weren't tuned into the broadcast on the Waterloo-Windsor game, once again, I had the immense privilege of being in the house doing the color commentating around, along with Adam McGuire, filling the seat of the one and only Mad Jack Moore, and just once again to all the people that make that event happen and everything. Like I've definitely spoken about before, my admiration for going as just like a spectator to those games. The Waterloo football community is really awesome, and you kind of feel like it feels like a real community event going there. And it was their black and gold day, so a lot of students were there, a lot of the people in the community were out. Really great environment. One of the cool things, and you obviously had this experience last year doing some of the work with Jack for some of the Laurier games, is when you get the media pass and you can kind of just be on the sidelines. And like I tried to get there early because I just wanted to be on, just go down to the field and kind of watch the teams warm up, and getting to see some of the coaches for the Waterloo side that we know, and of course getting to talk to Coach Burt, the absolute legend. But then I just want to give a couple quick shout outs to the offensive coordinator Brendan Conway, who's openly supported what we do without the 55. A former teammate of mine who I might have known was coaching there now, but Jamie Cook played at Guelph for 2 years, including my first year before transferring to Waterloo. He's doing quarterbacks there, and then getting to meet the running backs coach in Jesse Candela, who seeing me wear my at the 55 hat was like, oh, appreciate it. And of course he made a funny comment about D tier, because of course that's where we slide them in. But anyhow, to the game itself though, because once again, final score in this game: Windsor 37, Waterloo 0. And I was making this comment through the game. I was making it and talking with some of the coaches afterwards about kind of the flow of the game. Really reminiscent of their Week 1 opener at Ottawa, where you're going up against a team that, by our rankings or our tiered rankings, is better than you, based on how they performed last year is better than you, and based on current U Sports rankings, the two teams that are top 10 recognized. And also similarly, if you look at the final score, and perhaps it's more lopsided in this one, you certainly don't grasp the full picture of this game. This was a 15-0 game going into half, and obviously, the theme for Bertoya and Conway and that offense is we need to finish drives. But there were drives, including the opening one, where they were handing the ball to Anthony Miller, and they were picking up yards against a defense, and against specifically a front seven that we were really bullish on. And for Windsor, obviously, as I mentioned in shouting out Skelton for Offensive Player of the Week, he has a really nice performance, and I won't say too much more because I want to get your thoughts watching this one from the broadcast. But for Windsor, a lot of things we wanted to see, but the one thing that you just know has the dawn in all kind of just sorts, out of sorts, I should say, is the 17 penalties for 135 yards. And this was an incredibly chippy game. It was actually, from that standpoint, kind of additionally entertaining. But Tom, tuning into the broadcast, no doubt you had it on mute, so you didn't have to deal with hearing my voice 3 times in your week. What were your thoughts on this game?
Well, first, before I get into the game itself, I absolutely had you as the only one that I was listening to. You sounded fantastic, my friend, and I'm not just saying that. You had obvious, very clear on-air chemistry with Adam McGuire, who's another fantastic broadcaster, and he really knows what he's doing. But obviously, the love that you have for the game shone through in that. It made it really enjoyable to watch, just purely as a fan. And I was fangirling out, hearing you call it and hearing you have fun on there. I was so happy for you, man. You crushed it. You killed it. It was awesome to see.
Thank you.
I will also say, Brendan Conway, former Burlington Stampeder, with your boy here as well. So,
Hey,
yeah,
shout out to the horseshoe, man. The horseshoe's back, baby.
yeah, buddy.
Maybe they never went nowhere, but who knows? Anyways,
Yeah.
proceed.
But getting into this game here, yeah, first and foremost, 17 penalties for 135 yards. You can't have it. You cannot have it. Everything that I've seen from this Windsor team, especially watching them play against McMaster in the opening week and seeing some of the antics that I've seen, whether on the field and everything, they seem to be like a very emotional team. And I think Coach Cercelli still has that somewhat in check, in that, yeah, we're going to be emotional, we're going to get up, but I'm still focal, like using it as a focal point in order to, we're supporting our team, we're getting excited about the game, we have the potential to do this and kind of thing. But when you are a team that relies on its emotions, whether that be positive or negative, you wear that on your sleeve. And when something happens that you don't like, or, if a teammate gets a little bit of an extra push after the pile or something, you're going to say something, you're going to do something, whether that's a push or a shove or anything. And what the old adage is, the refs never see the first one, but they always catch the second one. So you have to make sure that you're still maintaining that composure there, so that you can, yes, something happens here and you bite your tongue, you get on with it. I'm going to get you next play in between the whistles where it's fair and, whatever. But yeah, you gotta, 17 penalties. It cannot happen, even before I get into anything about how the players played.
Well, then let me make one more comment before you get into that, just keeping with that theme. I mentioned, getting to go watch one of Western's training camp practices, and especially because it was their second of a 2-a-day practice, and my understanding from someone who was there in the morning that it was ultra competitive and physical, and then going for their afternoon practice, there was clearly a certain looseness. They seemed like they were having fun, but everything was buttoned up. There was no coaches being no walking on the turf, or hey, this, that, or whatever. Those players were on a mission. And going back to being able to kind of check out the pregame warm-ups with this for these teams, the one thing I loved seeing was when Windsor was warming up, you could see they're kind of singing, they're having fun and all that. And once again, that's great. And it's not necessarily this is perhaps correlative and not necessarily a causation, but you could perhaps be like, okay, clearly they want to be loose. And I think that's a great thing to want to instill as a coach, to let your players have that kind of freedom to be able to be themselves. But like all freedoms in life, there is a certain limit to those things, where if that same mentality leads you to, saying a couple extra words after the play is done, or just not you play to the whistle and then play is done and you leave it be. And, a few penalties on the Waterloo side that I'm certain Coach Burt won't be happy about either. But that was kind of one of my thoughts. I mean, maybe that's also perhaps one of the cost benefit of, you're bringing all these Americans, and maybe they're just a little more bombastic than us, quiet old Canadians or whatever. But no shots of the good old US of A, except that, of course, at the time of recording, we are slightly 12 hours past Team Canada basketball whooping that,
Let's go!
What, for the bronze medal in the men's. Hell yeah, let's go, little FIBA basketball at 5 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday. What would you rather be doing? But yeah, that was kind of my last thought. That it's somewhat, you can kind of make that narrative of hey, they looked loose in their warm-ups, and then they go out and they're in a game with a team that they should be beating the heck out of, and then they're getting all these penalties, and you can kind of piece that narrative together. But I do think that coming into a game like this for Windsor, and we've talked about their schedule coming up, I do think it's one of those things that it's unfortunate what the statement may kind of say about Waterloo, and I certainly know a lot of those coaches listen, so maybe earmuffs, where as a better team, you're we are almost certain we're winning this game. We want to see these things in specific. It's not hey, we need to just do whatever we can to pick up the win. We're pretty sure the win is going to come to pass, even if we have to go away from the things we want to see and just say, let's go back to our bread and butter. Let's just run the ball. Let's just do that thing and we'll win this game. But still, it's those penalties. It's those things that you can't necessarily just be in the film being like, oh, there's a little hitch in your step here, and that's why the ball came out a little bit here, or like, oh, you didn't make. Those are intangible things, but obviously there's more to this game than the intangibles and the penalties. We had players on the field, playing the game of football. What do you think about just the performances on the field and just what these two teams brought to the table?
You know what? The more that I've seen this, yes, I think in the past 3 games that Waterloo has played, there's a lot of things that I'd like them to clean up. I'd like that offense to be a little bit more efficient and whatever. But this is a much better team than I thought Waterloo was going to be going into this year. That defense really impressed me against Windsor. I mean, Joey Zorn does his thing. He goes 9 rushes for 92 yards. But Christopher John, who, like, you got a chance to see up close and personal, is a monster of a human being. Like you said on the broadcast, his arms are as big as your thighs are.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
He goes 10 attempts for 59 yards. And what I will say is that Christopher John, like we've said, he is very hard to get down. He gets the ball. He takes the first hit, maybe in the backfield or on the line of scrimmage. He shakes that one off. He shakes the second one off. And then there's another 2 or 3 warriors who are completely corralling around him, making sure that he's not gaining any more. Like, that defense was flying around, making tackles when they needed to. And it was pretty impressive. I liked what I saw from Waterloo, despite the fact that, yes, the final score is 37-0. And at 15-0, it's still 1 score and you're right back into the game. That's all you really have to do here. And that offense, I think, needs a lot of work. I think that Nick Orr, he goes 9 for 17, 89 yards and 1 pick. Like, you just can't do that. But that defense really seems to be coming along pretty well. Obviously, our defensive player of the week is Tyson Hergott, and the amount of things that he was doing on that side was just outstanding. But yeah, I was really happy with what I saw with Waterloo. On the Windsor side of things, like you said, huge shout out to Danny Skelton, 23 for 33, 391, 1 touchdown, 1 pick. I was almost... Well, last week when we were talking about how Windsor played against Guelph, I praised Danny for his decision-making and the way that he was commanding himself against that Griffin defense. I don't want to say he took a step back, but I didn't see the same level of that decision-making and that decisiveness there. I think the interception that he threw was something that he tried to force in. I think there was a couple of times where he thought he was going to take off and run. He got tackled short of the yard to gain. It was just, and credit to that Waterloo defense. Like I said, I don't want to take anything away from them, but I think Danny, and you play against a team that you know that you're better than, no matter what. There's going to be that issue of, I don't need to go the extra mile here because, we're the better team here, whatever. And you can't ever have that mentality because the great teams, they turn it on and they keep it on regardless of who they play against. So, yeah, I wanted to see a little bit better there, but at this point, honestly, I'm really just nitpicking. Windsor looked good and they dominated, and that defense really looked special.
They do, and actually let me take a chance to talk about some of those players, because we used the comment talking about Carleton's defense coming off of their first game at Laurier last week of just the adjective was fast. They look fast, and when Laurier was trying to run to the outside, there was a Raven just tracking him down. That is very much, watching these Lancers up in person, I should say, up close and personal. In particular, number 50, Jason Rashadzi. Wow, is he just a cannonball being fired of a human being? The speed, the assuredness in his tackling, and man, oh man, do we possibly? You mentioned Ife Onyeka, and we'll get to talking about him soon and his Ravens in their game, but Kuladia Musin. We mentioned his name last week. He got 3 sacks against Guelph. He follows up that performance with 2 more in this one. So it's we no doubt, perhaps both as former offensive players and just the nature of talking about really probably most sports is a bias towards offense than defense, and football is probably no exception. But a few of those guys looking really good. And one thing I'll say as well, and we've sort of made this comment a few times before, where big explosive plays are just part of the game. You can't just say, well, if not for, we talked about, the big run Guelph had last week, let's say, or, against Windsor, and being like, well, if you take that away, the stat line doesn't look too good for
Donovan Malloy.
Donovan Malloy, thank you. You have a really bad penalty pushes Waterloo out of at least field goal position early in the game with that really nice drive, and with Cole Crossett, he's as sure a foot to put it through the uprights as anyone else. The first major for Windsor is, when they went to a double tight formation, I was just like, oh my God, that's terrifying. If you're anyone watching this in the OUA, and our guy, Joey Zorn, now official fan of the podcast, or at least, I got to meet him, gave him a little swag, met his parents. I'm assuming it was parents. Spoiler, Tom isn't actually Joey Zorn's father. But shout out to Mr. and Mrs. Zorn, assuming that's who you are, that I met there at the game. If you're tuning in now from Flint, Michigan, what up? But he busts that big run. Then of course they get a punt return touchdown from Javoni Cunningham. So I mean, that's part of the game. But you can kind of play that game of like, if we're a little more assured in this, and what have you, maybe we limit that a little bit and we can finish some of these drives. All the way of saying, and I mentioned on the broadcast, and I promise this will be the last comment I make for right now. I mentioned this on the podcast, what Coach Lang used to talk about, of that progression of a developing team, where you might have a season where you're getting beat up across the board, even by teams remotely in sort of your atmosphere. We look at last year, they get that nice win on the road against York. They almost secure the comeback victory against Guelph. But other than that, not a terribly impressive year. Of course, we've talked about the numbers Caban put up. A lot of yards, a lot of interceptions. What's the direction of this team? James Basiliga, you're still an absolute beast. So we turn to this year. You start off against a team that was one of the top 3 teams in my estimations last year in the Ottawa GGs. You're on the road. Of course, we know they're top 10 ranked in all of U Sports, and you put up a really strong performance on the road. You then come home, you take care of business against the York Lions, much like you did last year. You're home against the Windsor Lancers, another ranked team, another team that has not Yates Cup aspirations, but is in conversations for they might win the Yates Cup this year. And if you think I'm crazy for that, then you're not watching these games. The Windsor Lancers are most certainly a Yates Cup contender this year. That is not even a question. And once again, despite the final score, you see a lot of positive things. And I've already mentioned it, and maybe I've perhaps been too mean to Guelph already, but September 30th, they'll perhaps take that next step of, you were in a tight game against a team like Guelph last year, and you take that step this year, now beating them. And then, that's that whole progression where then maybe the year after that, you're winning some of those 50-50 games, then maybe you're, starting to assert your dominance, and who knows? What other thoughts do you have about this one before we move on to our afternoon, our later afternoon games?
Yeah, I was really happy to see, like I said, Waterloo playing a little bit better than I expected them to. I'm very excited about this Windsor team, and like you said, it is not a hot take anymore to say they are a legitimate Yates Cup contender right now. This is a very, very impressive looking team here, and yeah, I'm excited to see where Windsor goes, and I'm hopeful that Waterloo, before this season ends, can add 1, maybe 2 additional wins on that win column before this is over.
I certainly think it's going to happen, and from talking with some of those coaches, they certainly think it's going to happen. And obviously, as a coach, as someone part of the team, like, it would be kind of startling if they're just like, man, we stink. But there's an earnest to the comments they make about their team. They're all qualified with, like, because of X, Y, and Z, because of the things we're seeing in practice. It's not just like a sound bite, like, we're going to give it 110% and we expect to pick up the win. There's good things happening there in Waterloo, and Battle of Waterloo, as we mentioned, taking place next week at Laurier. Always a fun environment, at least from what it looks like on TV. I've still yet to be there. I don't know if I'll be at that one. And one of the many games that we've already talked about to circle on your calendar if you have not yet is when these Windsor Lancers hit the road to take on the GGs coming off the bye in a game that I think will very much give us a sense of where those two teams are at, or at least, well, anyhow, we'll talk about that later in the week. That's a wrap on our 1 o'clock slate of games. Let's move over to the 3 o'clock game that started here in Toronto out of Varsity Stadium, where the Queens Golden Gales came to the 6 and picked up the win over U of T to the tune of 42-9. Another game where in the early throws, really tight, and going through the game, obviously, you have Queens getting their touchdown on I think it was their first or second drive, but Vrieken hitting Henning for the touchdown. And then Ryan Collins getting the pick 6 for Toronto to be like, oh my gosh, and kind of scoreboard watching, not knowing all the details at the time until I was able to watch this morning. You're kind of like, you're kind of worried because we get Laurier beating Queens in Kingston that first week, and the offense not really rolling. And it's like, okay, well, hold on. You know what? Offense takes a bit of time, and we could say that about both these clubs. Queens gets the bye. All right, let's start to refine our game. We don't have Anthony Souls, and maybe he'll come back. We've mentioned the names on that offensive line. Even just with Jared Kasari, we should be fine. Coming to this one, first half, wow, it's a super tight ball game, and you're thinking, there's no way this Queens team isn't what we think they should be able to do. Like it would behoove all reason and logic for Queens to all of a sudden just fall off a cliff this year. And we're still waiting for it. Obviously, they've only played 2 games. We're still waiting for the Alex Vrieken game, much like we just saw the Taylor Elgersma game, much like we just saw the Danny Skelton game. Obviously, we've already known Evan Hillock to be established, much like we've seen Keegan Hall, a couple Keegan Hall games. I'm just kind of scrolling through my schedule here to see. Oh, Guelph doesn't. Oh, too bad, Queens. You don't play Guelph. Anyways, I'm being mean at this point. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The day's gonna come where Guelph's gonna put it together, and I'm gonna be out there supporting them again, and people are gonna be like, "Oh, you were a hypocrite. You weren't with us when we were losing." It's like, maybe that will be true. A, I don't care, and B, once again, there's more to losing than just what pops up in the L column, and I have thoughts about some of the people with this team now. But we're not talking about Guelph. We're talking about Queens. We're talking about U of T. So yeah, Vrieken, 14-22, 155, touchdown, an interception. Of course, that interception going back 4-6 the other way. So yeah, not the outing we wanted. Kasari has a nice day. 17 attempts, 173 yards, 2 touchdowns. You love that, but still no Anthony Souls. Is a U of T team that we saw Guelph, move the ball on. Obviously, they had some defensive help, some special teams help as far as some of their production, putting up points. We saw Ottawa last week live in person, really run the ball on them quite proficiently, and obviously Queens mimicked that. What do you think, and is it just a function of time with Queens only having 2 games, the live bullets as you talked about, still no Anthony Souls? What do you think it's going to take for this offense to really come alive? Is it just a matter of time, or is there something else afoot here from kind of what you can surmise?
Well, the other thing you have to remember is this is Queens' second game of the season. A lot of the other teams, like we were just talking about Laurier and their offense really not looking as impressive as what they should be just last week. And now Laurier looks amazing, albeit against a team like Guelph. But once again, I don't want to focus on that anymore. But I think it's going to take a little bit more time for them to find a rhythm here, to find a groove. I think Alex Vrieken has obviously showcased what he could do last year with the amazing stuff that we really saw from him and how he was able to do. And, the rushing attack between Kasari and Souls last year, just those 2 guys alone was really impressive for sure. So I'm still high on this Queens team. I still think that they are, some of the upper in the upper half of the OUA at the very least. I don't know. I don't know about this Queens team. I think that they're going to get better, certainly, but I don't think that they're in that A tier right now. I think that they've got a lot of work to do before we can put them back in there. I really do. Vreekin is not showcasing the stuff that that we're expecting from him. And like I said, this is only week 2. There's a lot of things that I wanted to see here, but I don't know. Something gives me the rumbly bumblies about this Queens team, and I still need to see what they can do. And just so happens next week they're going to have a hell of a team to go up against. I don't want to get into next week, but then on the other side of things with Toronto, guys, what the hell is with that offense? Where is all of the excitement that we saw last year? You know, we talked about Adam Williams, we talked about Kinsale Phillip and the amazing. What is going on here, guys?
I really don't know, and it's so, like, as a Toronto guy, you know, Jack's mentioned it, that the league is better when these Toronto teams are doing well, and you know, we can go back to the Clay Sakara years when that offense was super explosive, didn't translate on the field. You know, we saw obviously in the 2021 year with the OUA East and OUA West, and it wasn't a hot take. I think it's of no offense to anyone to obviously state the OUA East was inferior to the teams we had in the West. U of T is able to make a playoff appearance, which put that whole East-West shortened season thing aside. Like, unless for some reason, unless like the school of U of T, like, you know, kicked your dog, like, how were you not happy to see them host a football playoff game, right? Aside from that, you know, we didn't really see much in that era, and we can go back to the Hunchak days at York, where there was that one year they go 3-5. They were like kind of in the mix at the end for maybe they'll at the very least they be in one of those conversations where we talk about seemingly every year. And it's one of the great things with covering this league. We have all these tiebreaker situations, right? And of course, you know, that was just a flash in the pan, in part, of course, because a lot of the talent they had on that team graduated out, and they had, you know, no seeming replacement. But it's just, it's heartbreaking to think that, like, dang, like, was that just a flash in the pan? Was a guy in Adam Williams who's been grinding it out for the Blues for I guess 5 years now? 4 or 5 years, has a really nice year last year. The breakout game against Carleton, and you know, obviously some of our commentary about the Ravens last year was that a lot of teams actually ran the ball quite well on them. So, you know, maybe it just comes down to that. But, you know, it just for so many reasons it's unfortunate. And of course, we see in this game, U of T goes to Scott Barnett. And I didn't take the time to pull up as well at quarterback, that is, right? I didn't take the time to pull up what his year, like, eligibility situation is. You know, Kinsale, despite last year being the first year we saw him, I think is a bit more of a mature student. Just from the standpoint of, you know, first year starting, not like he had just started his post-secondary career, which is my understanding. And so, you know, obviously, and maybe we'll do this at the midway point of the season. You know, revisit those tiers and kind of see where these teams actually are. Obviously, we kind of alluded to perhaps doing a little top 5 ranking, not solely just the top 5 teams as the schedule lists it. We were wrong about U of T. It seems we were wrong. Because then I'm thinking we had them in the C tier with Mac and Windsor.
Mm-hmm.
They ain't worth Mac and Windsor.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, I think if we could make one move, it might be bump up. It would certainly be bump Windsor back up. I mean, if we knew that they were certainly an A tier team, if we knew, but I don't think we would have thought that about them. And I think other than that, it would have been to switch Carleton and U of T. Carleton in the C tier with Mac, and then U of T down there with Guelph. But I don't know. It's a little disappointing, but yeah, I like, what do you think is the more, like, I guess perhaps is it still more disappointing looking at the less than outstanding performance we were perhaps hoping out of Queens, just as far as like the expectations that we had for them, or like I think that's still perhaps the narrative, or do you think right now on the bus back to, well, obviously not right now, but do you think on that bus back to Kingston, they're just like, we took care of business, we know where we have things to grow? Like, where do you think that mentality is like for the Golden Gales right now?
I think they know that there's a lot of stuff to clean up. I think they know that there's a lot of potential that's still on this team here, but despite the fact that Western does it every year, it is very hard to be continually a Yates Cup defender year after year after year. And Queens has done that the past couple of years, and credit to them. But there might be a bit of a hangover situation here if we're not if the guys aren't careful here. I have not seen them come out and been like, this is Gales football. Like this is what they want to put on the field as of yet. I think there's a lot of stuff that they want to focus on, and I think there's still a lot of capabilities for them to get even better. If Anthony Souls comes back, immediately that offense gets even better on the ground than what it is. But I don't know. I think nobody's coming back after this Toronto game with like grinning ear to ear with the win that they've had, and going into next week as well. Like you got to have your best week of practice that you've ever had to make sure that you can go up against guys. So I don't know. I think that no matter what, a win is a win, regardless if it's ugly or not. And I don't necessarily even think that this win was ugly by Queens. I just think that there's so much more potential to this team that they have the ability to showcase, and they have not showcased it yet.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, they put up 28 points in that third quarter. Of course, it includes the punt block and return. Jared Kasari busts like a massive, what was the number on it? It was a 28-yard run, but he had a couple other just like big gainers. He's showing 28 was the long. Maybe I'm mistaking that for something else. Perhaps I'm thinking of the Western game now that I think about it with Keanu Yazbek. But the one thing is just standing out to me now, I didn't think about it watching, but just kind of looking through the defensive box score, not seeing the name of Owen Hubert. And obviously, Van Wishart had a really nice game. He had a good season last year too, but 2.5 sacks in the game. We've mentioned Darian Newell, one of the more interior linemen, being a guy that obviously can create consternation for offensive lines. But if Hubert isn't in there as well, it's not as formidable a defensive front as one would like to think. And we've mentioned, of course, they had the 3 offensive linemen go to CFL camps and come back. And obviously the way they ran the ball yesterday, that O-line is pretty sharp, and they run that classic, well, maybe not classic, but from at least in recent times, that kind of pin and pull, like sweep look with the 2 guards leaking out, sealing the end there, and getting some big gainers there. But yeah, that Hubert thing just kind of stood out to me right now, not realizing in the game I wasn't necessarily hearing his name and not seeing him on the box score. But it's certainly a defense. That's the one thing that like maybe is this just us talking about Laurier last week of being like, you're home against Carleton. Obviously, as we'll talk about Carleton soon, Carleton's looking way better than, well, we didn't know much about Carleton coming into this year. And then, they bust out Laurier, that is, this week. And of course, the opponent Queens will be facing next week, in their third game, and having another, instance of being able to go and review live game tape as opposed to practice tape is going to make you that much better. But whatever we want to say about when that offense is going to bust out, and maybe it does take Anthony Souls coming back, and obviously the talent of Rican is there. We know it. We've seen it. It's certainly not I don't think flash in the pan is at all the case with him. I think he is real deal. But this defense, even putting Hubert aside, if you even can for an award-winning lineman like himself, you still have guys like Stefan East, who had a really nice game there in the defensive secondary, and obviously the man whose name I've never pronounced correctly, and I don't know if I ever will, and Ashton Miller Melanson, still being a ball hawk there for them as well. But as we said, Queen's going to return home next week, where they'll host the Western Mustangs, and for U of T, they're on their bye week, so we'll see. And obviously, it sounds or looks like the question of quarterback is a bit in the air for them. So we'll have to wait 2 weeks till we see what kind of resolution they come to on that front. Queens Western, as always, is going to be a must tune in television or online stream-o-vision, but we'll talk about that later in the week. Let's move to our final game of week 3, where those very Western Mustangs hit the road, where they went down to Ottawa to beat Carleton. Final score in this game, Western 31, Carleton 21. Okay. Now, Tom, we've said so many times, and we even actually talked in that Queens game of sort of using as analogy the slow start of Queens, of maybe being like, maybe that's just another thing that Western is kind of having an influence on, of this kind of like, you just grind them out, and then the second half, you just lay it on them. Windsor, that's kind of the case in that game too. So this is a game where going into the half, it's Carleton 14. It's Western 10, and a couple of those plays, I'm trying to remember where it happened. I mean, you had the muff punt by Western, and then the ensuing play. I mean, you gotta love the Ferdinand brothers. We still haven't seen Denny, but Kasim is such a weapon. He is a Swiss Army knife, and a part of his game we've yet to see until this past weekend was when he gets the little bubble screen pass, and of course he's behind Lefebvre, and then cocks that thing back and throws a strike into the end zone for the touchdown to put them up in this game. Obviously, in the second half, Western really starts rolling. The run game really comes alive. Keon Edwards with the bounce back game after last week with 143 on 24 carries. As we mentioned, Keon Yazbek with 136 carries. Of course, 81 coming on a single run. Did this feel the same way as other games where we've watched Western be tight in a ball game in the early going, and you just say, you know what, I'm just going to tune in the mid to late third, and they'll be up by a couple scores. Like, I'm not worried. Or are you starting to be worried at all with some of these tight games? Does this feel the same as years past where they might be starting a little slow and then put it on late? Or am I just reading too much into this a little bit?
No, I think this Western team is not as strong as it seemed, at least in the past couple of years here. I think that a couple of key players are playing lights out. You mentioned Keon Edwards, Keon Yazbek. Man, every single time I get a chance to watch Evan play, I am always just so enthralled with everything that I've seen for the kid. He goes 19 for 28, 254 yards and 3 touchdowns, but like his mobility within the pocket, like we talked about Ife Onyeka and all of the amazing stuff that he was able to do, and he was, he's trying to get into the backfield and trying to disrupt things. He doesn't finish with a sack because Evan is able to. There was one in particular, he goes for a pump fake and then steps up into the pocket, and Onyeka goes spiraling past him because he's not expecting that, and then he throws a dart downfield. Or there's another time where the play is kind of breaking down, Evan rolls out and then throws it as he's getting tackled to make sure that it's not a sack there. So I really, really love everything that I've seen from Hillock here. But yeah, this Western team doesn't seem as formidable. It certainly seems like they're a little bit more human. In previous years, we've kind of said, if you take away the top row, you take away the bottom row, it's really competitive inside the middle of the OUA. I think that top rung here is starting to get a little bit lower and lower, and people are starting to realize, hey, you know what? I can reach that. I can lift my arms up, and it's still going to take a ton of work because this is still a really phenomenal team, but I don't think they're uncatchable at this point, certainly. And the one thing that I absolutely loved from these Carleton Ravens is, yeah, like you said, Western put the ball on the turf a couple of times. Carleton came up with it, and they capitalized on Western mistakes. No team consistently last year were able to make the Mustangs pay anytime they, if they fumbled the ball. I was going to say if they threw an interception, but Evan didn't throw an interception all of last year. But when they made those mistakes, nobody really called them out until like Laval, quite honestly. And Carleton was starting to do that. I loved the play call to go to Kasim Ferdinand and get it down to Ben Huckabone in the end zone for that touchdown immediately after the muff pup recovery. Like, that's what you have to do with these Mustangs. You have to get them on their heels. And once again, we go back to the boxing analogy. But once you get somebody who's kind of on the ropes, you throw as many haymakers as you possibly can, because you don't know how hard it is, or if they get a chance to get back up, if you're going to have them in that position once again. Yeah,
no, great point. And the few things I want to respond to on that, and the first I'll say is I think it was on their first touchdown, the Lefebvre to Simon touchdown, where they had a 3rd and 3. It might have been on the 3rd and 3 they scored, and right away I'm thinking Western at Queens 2022, where I've talked about this drive so many times, or this sequence of drives where Queens goes for on 3rd deep in Western territory. They don't get it. Western gets the ball. I forget if they turned it over, or they did turn it over. I forget if it was a turnover, Dowds, whatever it was, interception, fumble. Queens gets it again. They have a 3rd, albeit longer than I think they had on the first go round. They kick the field goal. I love that, Corey Grant here. We talked about this being the Corey Grant era, and obviously we're starting to see a bit of the personality of this team kind of take shape in this new era, so to speak. And so that's a prime example of what you're saying. I would think as well. Yes, the you know what, hey, a turnover. There's I talked about on the broadcast like that idea of mojo is a real thing in sports and football, or whatever you want to call it, the just flow of the game, and you get an unforced turnover on the muff punt by the Western Mustangs. And I mean, Stu Lang always used to talk about sudden change, and dealing with it, both when it's negative and when it's positive. And not to say that Western was freaking out or whatever, but as Carleton, you have to be thinking you know what, we might have a shot here against a bit of a flustered team, because no one feels good after a situation like that. We saw in the Mac Windsor game, Windsor capitalizing on the Jackson Cooling unforced fumble on the punt return that led to a score for them. So yeah, I know I love the commentary on that plan. The thing I'll leave off, or I'll last thing I'll say on this game for right now, going back to what you're saying about how we think about the sort of shape and form of the OUA standings, you take off the top and the bottom, and it's a really really competitive 9, and now it kind of feels like a really competitive 5 or 6 maybe, and then a couple teams developing, and then York. But before, it's you have to have your perfect game against Western to beat them, because they weren't going to beat themselves. And we've mentioned it. We mentioned with a lot of these teams, and but with Western, we kind of just assumed, because of that institutional greatness that they have year after year, that hey, the next man up, and it's a cliche, but it always seems to ring true when we talk about the Purple Ponies. So maybe some of these mistakes we've seen early on, we saw penalties in a couple of their earlier games, some of these unforced turnovers, things like that, where maybe that'll all be cleaned up as some of these guys will continue to gel. But as I was saying, in the past, you had to play a perfect game because they weren't going to beat themselves. There's a couple of instances now we're seeing where Western is not being the Western that we know and who some love, where they're certainly going to be buttoned up and sharp. So you have to match that and then some, and take advantage of any possible opportunities. I'm not ultimately buying that, because as odd as it is to kind of see some of these things from Western here and there, it's just you got to pay the cost to be the boss, and you got to beat the best to be the best. And so far we've yet to see that in the OUA. And maybe we obviously joke. Actually, it's not joking. It's very serious. It's very real. The issue of going into Windsor and beating them with the golden arches in the background. It's maybe there's something for Western when they go to Carleton. I mean, obviously it's a long drive, night game. Who knows? It's obviously, as you highlight, that was a game that they lost 7 years ago or whatever. But I don't know. I don't know. What else do you think about this one? I mean, Tristan Lefebvre, ultimately another strong showing. Josh Ferguson, I didn't anticipate the breakout game. The numbers wouldn't show it, but definitely a couple carries where I just yes, let's go 23. Let's go, baby. What else do you think about this game? Maybe on the Carleton side of things, a bit more than just the immaculate play of Mr. Ferdinand.
Yeah, 100%. Lefebvre seems to be getting better each and every single week, which is really, really exciting to see. 17 for 27, 208 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 pick is a pretty good stat line against these Western Mustangs, who are arguably the best team in the OUA right now. And Josh Ferguson, exactly like you said, it seemed like he was about to get rolling so many times. He shrugged off a couple of Mustangs and a few carries, and then, those Stangs are so good at rallying to the ball and things. And I think that Carleton O-line, like we said, and shout out to that Western D-line. They're phenomenal run stoppers, but there was a couple of times where Riley McLeod is coming down, and he's a fantastic linebacker, but he's coming down free because guys are getting eaten up in that defensive front, and the offensive linemen aren't able to get off, and that's, you leave a middle linebacker free, especially one who's as good as Riley McLeod. He's going to make some plays. He's going to make some tackles, and you're not going to see what you want to see on the ground. So certainly that offensive line, I think, needs to get a little bit better on the run game side of things. I think they did a pretty good job protecting Lefebvre. There was a few times though where certainly he was hurried, and man, he took a few shots that were completely clean, and you didn't see any flags on that. And I agreed with all of those calls, but yeah, Lefebvre took some shots standing in there making some throws, and credit to him for being able to do that and not, getting scared of the hits or trying to run away from it or making a mistake that way. So I really like what I'm seeing from these Carleton Ravens. I know they're 0-2 right now, but they played against two very good teams so far. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this team really come roaring back in the later part of this season. Because I really liked what I saw.
Yeah, and no, I think that's a great point, just specifically about the caliber of competition they've played so far this season. And I don't, there's like I would be so disappointed to think that Carleton's coming out of those losses being like, man, we suck, we're 0-2. No, man, like you put up performances against teams that frankly I don't think people expected you to performance. I don't think people expected you to do. You mentioned that front seven. We talked about Western not seemingly having that pass rusher extraordinaire. Mentioned Von Muhldorfer before and how he just clogs up the lane, like maintains those double teams. And obviously, as you said, Riley McLeod can then come clean up the rest. And, Lawrence Bowers Kane and Max Nixon kind of as that starting group at the linebacker core, really doing a great job of just maintaining anything that can possibly get past the front line as far as runs. It's not getting past the three of them. But another guy on that front four that had a nice little show in Angelo Longo. Mm-hmm. Once again, even if it's not necessarily, he does finish with a sack in this game, likely the play you're talking about. But just in kind of quintessential fashion from the defensive standpoint, when we think about Western, of just like we're gonna sit in our base and we're gonna have some big dudes up front that are gonna be hard to push to the second level. When you coach offensive linemen, you coach double teams, you kind of paint the ideal situation as just like, don't even worry about, one of you coming off the block, just push the dude into the linebacker's lap. And, if ever there were a situation that's easier said than done, unless your name's Eric Anderson, it's that situation. But just him being able to maintain double teams, these guys just getting their big paws on these linemen and then just letting these great linebackers they have just fill in. Once again, as we said with Queens, like even if there's still some oddities here and there for Western, it's not the offense as we talked about with Queens, because Hillock has been as sharp as anyone for his 3 games so far defensively, and 21 points for Carleton should be noted. Of course, the one of them, Ferdinand seemingly scored the ball in every possible way, including a receiving touchdown pretty late in the going. Game was ostensibly done by then anyway. So, once again, in some ways, if the Western, it feels a little odd watching them this way this year so far. Next week, I think, is going to be supremely informative on our feelings about them and on Queens.
Yep, 100%, completely agree. Regardless of what my own personal thoughts are on these Gales, that's going to be the game of the week. That's going to be the one to really watch and see. And that's, I think, going to give us a real good showcase in terms of who's really at the top of the OUA here.
And I gave a shout out when we talked about Mac to my guy, Noah Amaral, out of London South Collegiate, and I would be remiss. I didn't mention his name after the York game, perhaps solely because we couldn't actually watch that game. I won't go rehashing that thing. All the venom is out of my body now at this point. I am a cool, calm, collected individual now, but. And for those watching, tuning in, I'm sipping water here out of my South Lions water bottle. Another former Lion in Amaral's class, in Marcus Robinson, getting a tackle in this game as well, 1 assisted and then a half tackle as well. just, hey, you know what? This is our podcast, Tom. I'm allowed to take moments to just shout out dudes that I have just so much love and admiration for. And if you don't know Marcus Robinson, you talk about as far as defensive lineman, just give it a couple years. He's that dude for sure. Any last thoughts on this one, Tom?
No, I think we honestly covered it. I think Western showcased that they are still the better team here, although there's probably a couple of cracks in the armor a little bit, and we'll see if Queens can capitalize on that. And Carleton is 100% a much better team than an 0-2 start.
1,000%. And as we mentioned, Carleton, hey, you're likely getting your opening win when you travel to Toronto to play the York Lions next week. And as we've said many a times, Western heading to Kingston to play Queens. And obviously we'll save the commentary for later in the week. But as I think Jack was the one who pointed out, they had to travel to Carleton for a night game. You come back home, that turnaround is really short, and then you travel back out to Kingston the following week. I'm going to be thinking about a few things in the next couple of days before we record for our Friday pod. I might even have to request we record on Thursday to give myself another day to mull things over. A little peek behind the curtain of how we do things up in this mug. But that's a wrap on week 3. What a joy to see so many of these offenses come alive. What a joy to see performances out of guys that, yeah, we've seen them do it before. But, as we've talked about, that era of quarterbacks we had and the future of the OUA is in such good hands with some of these young, talented guys that we've seen who we talked about all throughout the podcast today. So, if you aren't already in love with OUA football, and if you're tuning in to our show either on any of your podcast catchers or on YouTube, first of all, love you. Thank you so much for the support. But clearly you do love OUA football, because that's all this is about. Is if you love OUA football, you tune into this show. You have to love what you're seeing with these clubs right now. But as we said going into this week, in some ways, this was the aperitif, this was the amuse-bouche for week 4, where we are going to see some massive matchups. And of course, this is where these offenses really come alive. These guys have had game film to assess themselves, to assess their opponents, not from 2022, not based on who they think are coming into the fold, or players that they've recruited, or players that have transferred. These teams are taking shape, we are taking note, and so are the other clubs. So we'll talk to you about all those matchups later this week at the 55.